He was not meant to wear scarlet. His destiny was steel, not the cassock. Armand Jean Duplessis de Richelieu, the third son of an impoverished but noble family, was groomed for war from childhood. His world was supposed to smell of gunpowder and horse sweat, not incense. His entire nature, his mind, as sharp as a blade, his cold fury, and his unbending will, was forged for the battlefield and the command of armies. He was meant to be a soldier, to enhance the glory of the Duplessis name, and perhaps to lay down his life in one of the countless wars tearing Europe apart. But fate, that great trickster, had other plans. His childhood was joyless. Born in 1585, at the height of the French Wars of Religion, he was a frail, sickly boy, constantly plagued by fevers and headaches. This physical weakness only tempered his will. He learned early that if you cannot win with the strength of your body, you must win with the strength of your mind. His father, a captain in the Royal Guard, died when Armand was only 5, leaving the family in debt. The only valuable asset the Richelieu family possessed was the right to the bishopric of the tiny, wretched town of Luçon, a gift from King Henry III for his father's loyal service. By tradition, this church post was to be filled by the middle son, Alphonse. But Alphonse, a man of deep and sincere faith, refused at the last moment. He chose to become not an aristocratic bishop, but a simple Carthusian monk, retreating to a monastery. For the family, this was a catastrophe. Losing the bishopric meant losing their last source of income and falling into absolute poverty. It was then that his mother, a desperate and domineering woman, made a decision that would change the history of France. She looked at her youngest son, Armand, who was studying at a military academy, mastering the arts of fencing and horsemanship, and ordered him to trade his uniform for a cassock. For a 17-year-old youth who dreamed of battlefield glory, it was a devastating blow. He had to renounce everything he had prepared for and dedicate himself to serving a God in whom he, perhaps, did not fully believe. But he was a son of his time and his class. Duty to his family was paramount. He obeyed, but he did so in his own style. He did not simply agree to become a priest. He resolved to become the best. With the same ferocity he had once applied to military tactics, he threw himself into theology. In a few short years, he not only mastered the most complex theological works, but also became one of the most brilliant theologians of his era. He was too young to become a bishop under canon law, so he traveled to Rome and, using all his eloquence and intellect, personally convinced the Pope to make an exception. At 22, Armand Jean Duplessis de Richelieu became the Bishop of Luçon. His diocese was not merely poor, it was a veritable backwater. He wrote, "It was a land of war-torn churches, an impoverished and ignorant populace, and swamps teeming with malarial mosquitoes." For anyone else, it would have been an exile, the end of all ambition. For Richelieu, it became his first training ground. He did not despair. He set to work with the methodical persistence of a general fortifying his position. He rebuilt churches, reformed monasteries, and combated the ignorance of his priests. He learned to manage, to persuade, to command. He lived on the verge of starvation, but still managed to buy books, continuing his self-education. And he wrote. He authored several theological works, honing his pen, which would later become a weapon as sharp and deadly as his intrigues. It was in this remote wilderness that he met the man who would become his shadow, his other self, his most trusted and sinister instrument, a Capuchin friar named François Leclerc du Tremblay, known to history as Father Joseph, or the, quote, Seven. Father Joseph was Richelieu's opposite, a true mystic who dreamed of a new crusade against the Turks. Yet he also possessed a cold, calculating mind and was a genius of secret diplomacy. These two men, the ambitious bishop and the mystic friar, saw in each other kindred spirits. They both dreamed of restoring the greatness of France. Their alliance, forged in the swamps of Luçon, would one day decide the fate of all Europe. But Richelieu was suffocating in his provincial exile. All his thoughts were on Paris, on the Louvre, where real life unfolded, where intrigues were woven and power was divided. He awaited his chance, and history itself provided it. In 1610, King Henry IV, who had unified the country after the wars of religion, was assassinated by a fanatic. France was once again plunged into chaos. The throne passed to his young son, Louis XIII, while real power fell into the hands of his mother, the Queen Regent Marie de' Medici, a domineering but short-sighted woman completely dependent on her Italian favorites, primarily the adventurer Concino Concini. The country was being torn apart by aristocratic conspiracies, Huguenot, French Protestant uprisings, and the intrigues of the Spanish court. It was into these murky waters that the young Bishop of Luçon decided to dive. In 1614, he was elected as a representative of the clergy to the Estates General, the French Parliament. There he delivered a speech, calculated, eloquent, and full of flattery for the Queen Mother. He was noticed. His intellect, his ambition, and his ability to say what people wanted to hear impressed Concini. Soon, Richelieu was invited to court and appointed to the modest post of almoner to the young Queen, Anne of Austria, wife of the young Louis. It was the first step. He had entered the viper's nest. He was not yet a player, merely a pawn, but he had already begun to study the board, waiting for the moment to make his next decisive move. The Parisian court of the early 17th century was not just a center of power, but a simmering cauldron where poison was as common an argument as a dagger, and loyalty was measured only by the size of a bribe. Thrown into this world, the young Bishop Richelieu felt like a fish in water. He was an outsider, a provincial, but he possessed what many court aristocrats lacked: patience, discipline, and a mind that worked like a cold, flawless machine. He served the Queen Mother, Marie de' Medici, and her all-powerful favorite, Concino Concini, while carefully observing another rising power, the young King Louis XIII. Louis was a strange, withdrawn, and melancholic youth, long suppressed by his domineering mother. He stammered, trusted no one, and found solace only in hunting and in the company of his sole friend, a falconer named Charles d'Albert de Luynes. Richelieu was one of the first to realize that beneath this unremarkable exterior lay wounded pride and a firm will. He understood that sooner or later the king would want to become a true king, and so Richelieu began to play a double game. Publicly, he demonstrated absolute loyalty to Marie de' Medici, while secretly trying to establish contact with Louis's circle. The climax came in 1617. 19-year-old Louis, incited by his favorite, Luynes, decided on a coup d'etat. Early one morning at the gates of the Louvre, the captain of the royal guard stopped Concino Concini's carriage, and declaring him arrested by order of the king, shot him on the spot. A mob, which hated the Italian upstart, tore his body to pieces. The Queen Mother was effectively arrested and exiled to the Château de Blois. Her entire party, all her supporters, including Richelieu, fell into disgrace overnight. For Richelieu, it was a disaster. he had backed the wrong horse. His career, barely begun, had collapsed. He too was exiled from Paris, first to his impoverished diocese in Luçon, and then even further to Avignon, a papal territory where he was placed under close surveillance. It seemed to be the end. He was once again a nobody, a provincial bishop. But Richelieu would not be Richelieu if he had given up. In exile, he did not succumb to despair. He wrote theological treatises, maintained extensive correspondence, and most importantly, he waited. He knew that the political winds in France were as changeable as the weather, and he was right. Marie de Medici had no intention of accepting her situation. She escaped from the Château de Blois and raised the banner of rebellion against her own son, gathering all the disgruntled aristocrats to her side. The country was on the brink of a new civil war. It was then that the king's new favorite, Louis, realized he needed a man who could mediate between mother and son, someone Marie de Medici trusted. And that man was Richelieu. He was recalled from exile. It was his second chance, and he used it brilliantly. He went to the Queen Mother, and using all his eloquence and diplomatic skill, managed to convince her to reconcile with her son. He prevented a civil war. Both the king and his favorite, Louis, were grateful, but they still did not trust him. They saw him as the Queen Mother's man. They rewarded him, but did not bring him back to court. Richelieu was once again sidelined. He waited for 3 more years. During that time, Louis died, and King Louis, who had never learned to rule on his own, found himself in a vacuum. He changed ministers like gloves, but could find no one to rely on. The country was again descending into chaos. Aristocrats plotted conspiracies. The Huguenots in the south of France created a virtual state within a state with its own army and fortresses. And abroad, the powerful Habsburgs, rulers of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, were encircling France, threatening its very existence. Marie de Medici, having returned to court, relentlessly urged her son to bring Richelieu back into the government. She still considered him her creature. She even secured for him the rank of cardinal from the Pope, making him one of the highest dignitaries in the Catholic Church. Louis resisted for a long time. He instinctively sensed in this man a frightening power and an abyss of ambition. He feared him. But the situation in the country was so desperate that he finally gave in. In April 1624, Armand Jean du Plessis, Cardinal de Richelieu, entered the royal council. At first, he was given a modest role, but very soon his intellect, his incredible capacity for work, and his clear vision for France's future made him indispensable. The king, who had feared him for so long, had finally found the man he had been searching for his entire life. He had found someone who could think and act for him. A few months later, Richelieu became the kingdom's first minister. At 39, he had been handed France, a nation that was weak, divided, and on the brink of collapse. He had a plan. It was clear, ruthless, and comprehensive. He laid it out for the king in the plan had 3 points. First, to destroy the political power of the Huguenots, so that there would be only one law and one army in France, the king's army. Second, to break the pride and independence of the high aristocracy, forcing them to transform from feudal lords into obedient servants of the crown. And third, the most important, to raise the name of the king in foreign nations to the rightful place it should be. This meant crushing the power of the House of Habsburg and making France the dominant power in Europe. This was a program for a lifetime, and to achieve it, he was prepared to do anything: to deceive, to betray, to terrorize, to wage war. He had obtained power, and now he was about to show the world what the will of the state, embodied in one man, truly meant. The dance on the knife's edge was over. The era of the quote had begun. Having seized power, Richelieu did not hesitate. He was not a dreamer, but an architect, and before him lay a country in ruins. To erect the magnificent edifice of absolute monarchy on this site, he first had to clear the ground, to destroy the two forces that had torn France apart for centuries: the political independence of the Huguenots and the feudal license of the high aristocracy. These were two dragons he had to tame or kill, and he began with the one he deemed more dangerous. The Huguenots, France's Protestants, were not merely a religious minority. Thanks to the Edict of Nantes, signed by Henry IV, they had become a state within a state. They had their own armies, their own taxes, their own laws, and, most importantly, a network of powerful fortresses scattered across France. Their capital, their stronghold, their symbol of defiance, was the port city of La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast. It was an impregnable fortress that received aid and weapons from France's main maritime enemy, England. For Richelieu, the existence of such an independent enclave was unthinkable. He was not a religious fanatic. He cared little for theological disputes. He was a statesman, and he understood that as long as La Rochelle stood, there could be no single authority in France. In 1627, he took action. He gathered the full might of the kingdom and personally led the siege of La Rochelle. This was not just a military operation. It was an epic contest of wills. Richelieu, a cardinal of the Catholic Church, proved himself a brilliant general and engineer. He knew that taking the city by storm was impossible. It could only be taken by starvation. To do this, he had to sever the city's main artery, its connection to the sea, from which English ships brought supplies and reinforcements. And Richelieu ordered the impossible: the construction of a massive seawall that would completely block access to the harbor. This titanic effort lasted 14 months. Thousands of soldiers and laborers, knee-deep in icy water, under constant fire from the city walls and attacks from the English fleet, built this colossal dike nearly a mile long. Richelieu was everywhere. He lived in a field camp, personally supervised the work, and appeared in the most dangerous places to inspire his soldiers. Once, a cannonball struck the wall next to him, showering him with earth, but he did not even flinch. He was the embodiment of unbending will. Meanwhile, hell reigned in the city. Famine claimed thousands of residents. They ate rats, shoe leather, and grass. Of the 28,000 inhabitants, only 5,000 remained alive by the end of the siege. But they did not surrender. Their mayor, Jean Guiton, swore to plunge his dagger into the heart of anyone who spoke of capitulation. But even their heroism was powerless against the cardinal's iron grip. The English fleet, unable to break the blockade, sailed away. All hope was lost. In October 1628, La Rochelle fell. Here, Richelieu showed himself not as an avenger, but as a wise politician. He did not carry out the massacre everyone expected. He showed mercy. He confirmed the Huguenots' religious freedom. They could continue to practice their faith. But he took everything else from them: their fortresses, their armies, their political rights. The walls of La Rochelle were razed. The state within a state ceased to exist. Henceforth, there was only one power in France: the kings. The first dragon had been beheaded. Now it was the turn of the second, the proud, arrogant aristocracy. The great dukes and princes of the blood, the Montmorencys, the Guises, the Condés, were accustomed to seeing themselves as the king's equals. They maintained private armies, hatched conspiracies, raised rebellions, and formed alliances with foreign powers. To them, France was not a homeland, but a collection of estates to be divided and redrawn for their own benefit. Richelieu resolved to end this. He declared that from now on, the king was the sole master of France, and all others were merely his subjects, obligated to serve the state. His first blow was an edict against dueling. Duels were a sacred cow of the aristocracy, a way to defend noble honor. But for Richelieu, they were a senseless waste of blood that claimed the lives of the kingdom's finest warriors. He banned dueling on pain of death. The aristocracy scoffed at the ban, so Richelieu made a public example. When one of France's most notorious duelists, the Comte de Bouteville, brazenly fought a duel in broad daylight in the Place Royale in Paris, Richelieu had him arrested. The entire nobility, including all his relatives, pleaded with the king for a pardon. But Richelieu was adamant. "It is a question of Bouteville," he told the king, "but also of cutting the throat of dueling or of your Majesty's edicts." Bouteville was beheaded. The aristocracy was in shock. They realized this man in a cassock was not bluffing. But his chief weapon against the nobility was his spy network, the Cabinet Noir, which he created with Father Joseph. His agents were everywhere, in bedrooms, in confessional booths, in embassies. They intercepted letters, eavesdropped on conversations, and recruited servants. No conspiracy could escape his all-seeing eye. And punishment was swift and inevitable. He established a special tribunal to try conspirators, with verdicts often decided in his office beforehand. Conspiracies that once ended in exile or disgrace now ended on the scaffold. He beheaded the Duc de Montmorency, one of the noblest men in France. He threw marshals into the Bastille. He made no distinction between a prince and a commoner. Before the law, that is, before the will of the king as embodied by him, all were equal. The culmination of his struggle with the nobility was the famous Day of the Dupes in 1630. The Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, who had once brought him to power, had become his bitterest enemy. She realized she had created a monster she could no longer control. She organized a powerful conspiracy to oust him. One day, she cornered King Louis in the Luxembourg Palace and threw a hysterical fit, demanding he choose either her, his mother, or this, the weak and indecisive king seemed to yield. Richelieu, hearing the news, prepared to flee. The entire court celebrated his downfall. His enemies were already dividing his offices. They had been duped. That night, Louis XIII secretly summoned the cardinal to Versailles. He had made his choice. He chose France, not his mother. The next day, all the conspirators were arrested. Marie de Medici was permanently exiled from the country. Richelieu had obtained absolute, unlimited power. He had won. He had tamed the internal dragons. But he paid a terrible price for it. He was hated. The aristocracy cursed him. The common people saw him as a bloodsucker, and assassination attempts were constant. He lived like a prisoner in his lavish palace, surrounded by an army of bodyguards. He was the most powerful man in France and the loneliest. But his work was only half done. Having secured his rear, he could now turn to the third and final dragon, the mighty House of Habsburg, which held France in a death grip. Having secured royal authority within France with an iron fist, Richelieu turned his cold, calculating gaze toward Europe. He faced a task of titanic complexity. France was suffocating, caught in a giant vice that tightened with each passing year. From the south, in Spain, and from the east, in the Holy Roman Empire, it was threatened by the same enemy, the mighty House of Habsburg. The Spanish and Austrian branches of this dynasty, united by family ties and a fanatical devotion to Catholicism, dreamed of creating a universal Catholic empire that would dominate the continent. France, with its independent policy, was the main obstacle in their path. For Richelieu, this was not just a geopolitical threat, it was an existential challenge. If the Habsburgs won, France would cease to exist as a great independent power, becoming a satellite, a province of their pan-European empire. The cardinal decided to dedicate the rest of his life to preventing this. The stage for this grand battle was already set. In the heart of Europe, across the lands of Germany, one of the most terrible and bloody wars in human history had been raging for a decade, the 30 Years' War. It began as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants within the Holy Roman Empire, but soon morphed into a continent-wide slaughter, drawing in everyone from Sweden to Spain. The Habsburg armies, led by the talented generals Tilly and Wallenstein, were winning victory after victory. It seemed the Protestant cause was doomed, and the creation of a Catholic empire under Vienna's aegis was only a matter of time. It was here that Richelieu, a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, a man who had just drowned a Protestant rebellion in his own country in blood, made an unthinkable, cynical, and brilliant move. He decided to save the Protestants in Germany. This decision shocked all of Catholic Europe. He was accused of betraying the faith, of allying with heretics, of conspiring with the devil. The Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, and the entire at court begged the king not to enter this sinful alliance. But Richelieu did not care. For him, there was only one religion, the religion of the state. His God was France, and he was willing to make a deal with anyone, be it the Turks or Lucifer himself, if it served the interests of his deity. He formulated this principle himself, and it became the alpha and omega of all modern diplomacy. Raison d'etat, reasons of state. The interests of the state, he believed, were superior to the interests of religion, dynasty, and even morality. But he was too clever to throw a still weakened France into open war immediately. He decided to act through others, waging a war by cabinet, a war fought not with swords, but with gold and intrigue. His first weapon was King Christian IV of Denmark. Richelieu secretly funded his invasion of Germany, hoping the Danes could stop the Habsburgs. But Wallenstein's army easily crushed the Danes. The first gamble failed. Then Richelieu found a new, far more powerful champion, King Gustavus II Adolphus of Sweden. Known as the Gustavus Adolphus, was a military genius, an innovator, and a fervent Lutheran who dreamed of creating a great Protestant empire on the Baltic. Richelieu saw him as the perfect weapon. Through his loyal father Joseph, he concluded a secret treaty with Gustavus Adolphus. France pledged to pay Sweden enormous subsidies, 1,000,000 livres a year, and in return, the Swedish king would invade Germany with his army, the best in Europe. Thus, the Catholic cardinal became the primary sponsor of a Protestant crusade. The invasion of Gustavus Adolphus in 1630 turn the tide of the war. His army, using new linear tactics and light mobile artillery, began to crush the cumbersome imperial forces. He won a brilliant victory at the Battle of Breitenfeld and swept through Germany with fire and sword, reaching as far as Bavaria. Richelieu's plan seemed to be working perfectly. The Habsburgs were on the verge of total defeat. But then, something he had not foreseen happened. His weapon proved too effective. Gustavus Adolphus became so powerful that he began to pose a threat to France itself. He dreamed not just of protecting German Protestants, but of becoming their new emperor. Richelieu realized with horror that in trying to destroy one empire, he risked creating another, even more dangerous one in its place. But fate intervened once more. In November 1632, at the bloody Battle of Lutzen, Gustavus Adolphus was killed. The Lion of the North had fallen. The Protestant cause was again on the brink of collapse, and Richelieu understood that the time for fighting with foreign hands was over. Now, France itself had to enter the war. In 1635, having forged alliances with Sweden and the Dutch, France officially declared war on Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. This marked the beginning of the final, most brutal phase of the 30 Years' War. The so-called, it was a total war, fought on multiple fronts, in Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and the Pyrenees. The first years were disastrous for France. Spanish troops invaded from the north and advanced almost to Paris. Panic gripped the capital. Richelieu's enemies again raised their heads, demanding his resignation and an immediate peace. King Louis wavered. It seemed the great cardinal had gambled everything and lost. It was at this moment that Richelieu displayed his iron will. While everyone around him panicked, he remained as cold as an iceberg. He personally rode through the streets of Paris to calm the crowds. He pawned his own jewels to raise money for the army. He dismissed incompetent generals and appointed young, talented commanders like the Prince of Condé and Turenne in their place. And his persistence paid off. The French army, reformed and battle-hardened, began to win victories. Slowly, at a terrible cost, the scales began to tip in favor of France and its allies. He waged this war until the very last day of his life. He did not live to see its end, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which would cement the triumph of his policies. But he already knew he had won. He had shattered the power of the Habsburgs, secured France's dominant position in Europe, and laid the foundations for its future greatness, which would reach its zenith under Louis XIV. But this triumph came at a terrible price. The war had exhausted France. Taxes skyrocketed, leading to constant peasant revolts, which he crushed without mercy. He was the most hated man in the kingdom, but it did not bother him. He served not the people, not the aristocracy, not even the king as a man. He served an abstract, cold idea, the idea of the state. And for this deity, he was prepared to sacrifice everything and everyone, including himself. Over the years, Richelieu transformed from a man into the living embodiment of the state. His personal life ceased to exist, completely dissolving into endless work. He rose before dawn and went to bed long after midnight. His days were scheduled to the minute. Hours-long meetings with the king, receiving ambassadors, reading hundreds of reports from spies, dictating orders to generals and intendants. His only diversion was his cats, which he adored and gave whimsical names. In his lavish Parisian palace, the Palais Cardinal, later the Palais Royal, which surpassed the Royal Louvre in splendor, He lived like a prisoner. He was constantly tormented by illnesses, migraines, tuberculosis, and agonizing abscesses. But overcoming physical pain, he continued to work with undiminished energy. He knew his time was running out and hurried to complete his life's work. His relationship with King Louis XIII was perhaps the strangest and most complex political partnership in history. It was not a friendship, but a symbiosis, a union of two completely different yet complementary natures. Louis, melancholic and insecure, but possessing a deep sense of royal duty, found in Richelieu the steel spine he lacked. Richelieu, a genius of power, but lacking royal blood, found in Louis the legitimacy he needed. They often argued and quarreled. The king at times hated his all-powerful minister who overshadowed him. But never, not for a moment after the Day of the Dupes, did he betray him. Louis was the only person in France who understood that everything this fearsome, universally hated man did, he did not for himself, but for the crown, for the greatness of France. "The cardinal and I are one," he would say, and it was true. Together they formed the ideal ruler, the will of one and the intellect of the other. Richelieu thought not only of wars and intrigues. He was obsessed with the idea of French greatness in all things. He understood that a state's true power lay not just in its army, but also in its culture. And he decided to take control of that as well. In 1635, he founded the Académie Française, tasked with developing the rules and standards of the French language, and creating a dictionary to solidify its purity and preeminence. This was not merely a philological project, it was an act of cultural imperialism. He wanted French to become the language of diplomacy, science, and literature for all of Europe, just as Latin had once been. And he succeeded. He patronized artists, architects, and playwrights like Corneille. But his patronage was always tyrannical. Art, like everything else, had to serve the state, glorifying the king and his first minister. But the more power he concentrated in his hands, the deeper his loneliness became. He was hated by everyone. The aristocracy he had stripped of its privileges, the people he had crushed with taxes, even his own family, which he ruled with an iron fist. His last and most dangerous enemy was the Marquis de Cinq-Mars, a handsome young man whom Richelieu himself had introduced into the king's circle to become his favorite and report on the monarch's moods. But Cinq-Mars, intoxicated by his proximity to power, imagined himself a new Concini. He entered into a conspiracy with the king's brother, Gaston d'Orléans, and, most terrifyingly, made a secret treaty with Spain, France's mortal enemy, promising them peace in exchange for the cardinal's removal. This was the aristocracy's last attempt to reclaim power. Richelieu was already mortally ill. He was carried on a special litter that sometimes had to be brought into rooms through holes knocked in the walls. It seemed he would die at any moment, and his enemies were already celebrating. But they underestimated this dying lion. His spy network performed flawlessly. His agents intercepted a copy of the treasonous treaty with Spain. Richelieu, gathering his last strength, presented the document to the king. For Louis, it was proof of high treason. Without hesitation, he handed his favorite over to the cardinal. Cinq-Mars and his accomplices were arrested and beheaded. Even as he was dying, Richelieu continued to send the state's enemies to the scaffold. It was his final victory. In the autumn of 1642, it became clear he would not live to see Christmas. He lay in his Parisian palace, surrounded by doctors who could no longer help him.
King Louis came to bid him farewell.
"Here we part," Richelieu said in a weak voice. "In leaving your Majesty at the height of his power, I take comfort in leaving the kingdom in greater order than ever before." He gave the king his final advice, recommending as his successor another cardinal, the Italian Giulio Mazzarino, whom he himself had trained in the subtleties of his craft. When the priest who came for his final confession asked if he forgave his enemies, Richelieu uttered the phrase that became his epitaph: "I have had no enemies other than those of the state." He died on December 4th, 1642. When news of his death spread through Paris, many sighed with relief. People lit bonfires in the streets, celebrating their deliverance from the tyrant. They did not understand his legacy to them. He had received France when it was weak, fragmented, torn by internal strife, and surrounded by enemies. He left it the most powerful, centralized, and influential nation in Europe. He created the absolutism that would reach its zenith under Louis XIV. He created the France that for a century and a half would be the cultural and political center of the world. He was cruel, ruthless, and cunning. He knew neither friendship nor love in the common sense of the words. His only passion, his only god, was the state. And to this deity he sacrificed everything: the happiness of the people, the lives of his enemies, and his own life. He was not the soldier in a uniform he had dreamed of being in his youth. He was a soldier in a cassock who fought the longest and most important war, the war for the birth of modern France.